کاوش مدیا.
So just days after the United States withdrew from Afghanistan, 4 top Democrats started their Middle East tour where they warned the country of Lebanon about becoming another, quote, horror story. Now, that description, one may argue, pales in comparison to America's hasty withdrawal from Afghanistan that saw frantic evacuations and a suicide blast that killed 13 U.S. service members and dozens of Afghan civilians. Well, now that the war there is ended, it appears these 4 senators have set their sights on Lebanon. Take a look here. The small country with a population of 6.5 million people, it's surrounded by Syria, Israel, and the Mediterranean Sea, but it's on the brink of an economic collapse with no government in place. Well, the economic conditions have become so poor there, some Lebanese officials have reached out to Iran to help solve their fuel crisis. Iran, a close ally to the Shiite-led Hezbollah group, has agreed to transport fuel to Lebanon. Now, while this might seem like a nice gesture from Iran, U.S. Senator Chris Murphy has assured the Lebanese people that the U.S. is actively working on ways to solve their fuel shortage. How, you may ask? By transporting fuel from Egypt through Jordan and then through heavily sanctioned Syria, where it will then be redirected to Lebanon. Oh, and get this. So in order to deliver all of that fuel, the U.S. is actually going to have to find a way to transport it around their own sanctions. So joining me now to discuss all of this situation going on in Lebanon, I am joined from London by Hedi Nasrallah. He is a Lebanese researcher and activist. Hedi, thanks so much for coming on. First things first, as I mentioned, kind of hilarious how the United States has to now meander around its own sanctions in the region, but how have the U.S. sanctions against Syria affected neighboring Lebanon?
Thank you for having me. In Lebanon, we have a saying that Syria is the lung of Lebanon. So Lebanon has been dependent on Syria in so many ways, economically, politically, and even regionally, of course. And that has been proven throughout history and throughout the recent years, especially during the political crisis that's been happening in both countries. But the main obvious effects against Lebanon because of the U.S. sanctions on Syria was mainly Lebanon is a country that depends on importing stuff more than exporting. But the things we export were heavily affected because our only main road to export our goods is Syria.
You know, you did bring up oil and fuel again, and, you know, fuel is fuel. But, you know, why is the fuel from Iran frowned upon by the U.S. and some of those Gulf states there, as opposed to, you know, other countries that are taking it and they're fine with it?
Well, for that, there's 2 reasons. The first reason is they do not want Iran to bypass the sanctions against it. They do not want Iran to give other countries their oil or benefit from them financially. And that's because, first of all, the U.S. has an opinion on Iran. We all know that. But when it comes to the Gulf, Iran is a big opponent in the region, especially if they're going to start importing their oil. That's going to affect Saudi Arabia and other regional countries that are basically anti-Iran. And what Iran did, basically, with doing that, sending their oil to Venezuela, Cuba, Syria, Lebanon, that's actually a big, that's alerting some regional countries more than it's alerting the U.S. They are asking the U.S. to get involved more than the U.S. even wants to get involved in that. And the second reason for that is the U.S. is sanctioning those countries that Iran's trying to help them and make relieve their economy. And U.S. policies are, by now we all know that they're trying to subjugate those nations into abiding by any U.S. agenda in any region. And what Iran is doing, it's basically, they're not going to completely help those economies, but they're hindering any U.S. policy in the region by helping those countries.
And, you know, I've got about a minute left here, but I do want to ask you this. You know, does the U.S. offer to deliver the fuel to Lebanon? Do you think it's going to come with some strings attached? And, you know, if it does, what do you think Washington wants in return from Lebanon?
The U.S. always wants something, and there's always strings going to be involved, because if it's out of goodwill, they could have helped or even offered their plans 10 years throughout the crisis what's been happening in Lebanon. The U.S. ambassador to Lebanon only announced her plan a day after Hezbollah leader Nasrallah dramatically announced that he's bringing the first ever oil ship from Iran. And then suddenly the next day she said, we have a plan ready. You've been waiting 10 years to announce it right now, a day after Nasrallah announced we're bringing fuel from Iran. And they don't even have a plan set. She said that she wants to help us bring gas and oil throughout from Egypt and Jordan via Syria to Lebanon. But Syria is sanctioned by the US. And yesterday, the US delegate, those senators, they said that any oil coming from Syria is basically going to go under sanctions. Your ambassador is saying one thing and you guys are saying something else. So they don't even know what the plan is because they don't even have a plan for Lebanon. Their plan was always destruction and subjugating the nation because their main demands is the security of Israel. That's it. They don't care about the well-being of Lebanon. They care about the security of Israel and they care about Hezbollah and their weapons.
آنچه در مورد ما میگویند